are the 5 points of Calvinism, and how did they come about?
Yeah, the 5 points of Calvinism spell out tulip, and it's a pretty good description of basically what Calvinism is. And so for tulip, the T is for total depravity, that man is so depraved in our fallen state that we would never freely accept Jesus under any circumstance. And then the U is unconditional election, that God chose us not because He foreknew we would believe, He just chose us to believe. And then He regenerated us, gave us a new nature so that we would believe. So it was unconditional. It was nothing in ourselves. We don't even have the ability to believe. And then the L was for limited atonement, that it makes sense if it's all of God's doing, if it's monergism, if God alone is at work, and it's not synergism where we freely accept God's saving grace. If God alone is at work, then it makes sense that Jesus would only die for the elect. It makes no sense whatsoever that Jesus would die for all mankind if it's all His work, if there's no response. And by the way, the Arminian is not saying that we have to work for our salvation. The Arminian is saying, though, we have to freely accept the salvation that was totally won by Christ, at least the non-heretical Arminian. So the L is limited atonement. I is irresistible grace. If God regenerates us so that we would believe, then with a new nature, we can't even resist it. We have to believe. And so God's saving grace is irresistible at that point that we accept the gospel message. And then P is perseverance of the saints. It makes no sense for God to predestine us for salvation if He's then going to allow us to live long enough to lose our salvation. And so God supernaturally causes believers that He saves to persevere in the faith. So basically a believer cannot lose their salvation. So those are the 5 points of Calvinism. Now, did John Calvin come up with these? No, he didn't. This was at the Synod of Dort, well after Calvin's death, where the teachings of Jacob Arminius, and Jacob Arminius considered himself reformed. He considered himself a loyal disciple of John Calvin. He just thought that Calvin went too far on the sovereignty issue and took man's choice out of the picture. And so the 5 points of Calvinism were made by strong Calvinists who understood Calvin's thought, and at the Synod of Dort, they responded to different aspects of Arminian thought. And so, though John Calvin didn't come up with the 5 points of Calvinism, I think they accurately represent what John Calvin taught. Now, in Calvin's commentaries, you could make a case that maybe Calvin didn't teach limited atonement. I will say 2 things about that. One is, it's also possible to interpret what Calvin was saying about that as just Jesus' sacrifice being worthy to cover all of mankind's sins, not necessarily that He died for all mankind's sins. So it's not inconsistent with limited atonement. That's number one. Number two, if Calvin did not knowingly hold to limited atonement, I think if he were shown the logic of the other 4 points, I think he would have been rational enough to embrace limited atonement. So basically what I'm saying is those people who call themselves 4-point Calvinists who reject limited atonement, it doesn't really make sense with the other points of Calvinism. And I think it does accurately represent 5-point Calvinism. I'll give you an example. R.C. Sproul's work. R.C. Sproul is a true, consistent Calvinist. And he takes the tulip, and he doesn't reject any of the points, but he explains them using different words, but he explains the same concepts and accepts each one of those concepts. And so basically what R.C. Sproul is saying is, I accept tulip. I explain it a little differently, but I accept each one of these points as accurately representing not only what the Bible teaches, but what John Calvin taught. Now, I personally am not a Calvinist myself, although I do hold to the fifth point, perseverance of the saints. I don't believe a believer could lose their salvation. For me to call, it would be an honor to call myself a Calvinist, but I think I would do an injustice to John Calvin and his brilliant thought to call myself a Calvinist. In fact, my Calvinist friends would be offended if I called myself a Calvinist. And that's kind of unfortunate that we have a lot of people referring to themselves as four-point Calvinists, when sometimes they're even more Arminian than Arminius, Jacob Arminius was. And so, though they would hold to eternal security, many of these guys, they at times have even a weaker view of the first point, total depravity, than Jacob Arminius had. So, whatever the case, I think there's room for John Calvin. There's enough room in heaven for both John Calvin and Jacob Arminius. Some of today's Arminians are rather radical. I wish they would read Arminius. They'd be even closer to Calvin than they think. But I think it was Whitefield and John Wesley and the Methodists that would debate. And Whitefield was the Calvinist. Wesley was the Arminian. And they asked Whitefield. They were very heated debates. And I think we need these heated debates in love, in Christian love. But they asked Whitefield, do you think you'll ever see John Wesley in heaven? And he paused for a minute and he said, no, I don't think I'll ever see John Wesley in heaven, because he's going to be too close to the throne room of God for me to get a glimpse of him. And so what he was saying was, I don't question John Wesley's genuine faith in Christ. I don't question that he's saved. But I think he's off the wall on a few very important issues, and so we passionately debate the issues, but it doesn't mean I'm damning that Christian brother to hell. And I think John Wesley would say the same of Whitefield. We need that kind of Christian love, but these are important issues. And I think we both agree we're saved by God's grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus alone. Now, what does that all entail? What does that all imply? How do we unpackage that? We may differ on that, and those are some important issues. But I think we need to dialogue, speak the truth in love, dialogue on these issues in Christian love, and so I think we need more dialogue, not less.